Good afternoon, welcome to this third day of Vicino Lontano. Today it's Friday and it's a gorgeous, warm, sunny day, 24 degrees Celsius, one of those first real warm days of spring. It's wonderful. The vibe is so exciting. Now it's 6 p.m. We have the same exact problem as yesterday. There are three super interesting events going on all at the same time. The first one is called Armed Europe, from the world wars to Ukraine. The second one is about the situation in the prisons and the lack of human rights, the abuses. This one actually is maybe the one that I'm gonna choose, or the first one. Let's see. The third one has a very funny title for me that I live in the United States. It's titled Elon Musk, the man who wants to solve the future. And the guest of this talk is a journalist and university professor who wrote a book with the same title. Actually, there are other two events at the same time. One about the symbolic power. It's a reflection on a book of Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss, I don't know how you pronounce it, sorry I don't speak French, the famous anthropologist. And the last one is about a minoritarian language in Sardinia, which is the Sardinian. Also a very interesting topic for me because I speak Friulan, which is also a minoritarian language in Italy, just as Sardinian is. So I would love to be able to go, but unfortunately, I'm gonna have to skip it. I still don't know what to choose. We're gonna see. Let's go. Okay, today I adopted a new technique. I tried to participate to two different talks, so I got bits and pieces of each one of them. First one was the one about the prisons and the situation of the human rights in Italian prisons. Again, I'm gonna report just the part that I listened to. Prisons cannot be the only sentence, and it's also up to the Magistratura, which is the Italian institution for judges, of the judges. It's up to them to give the adequate sentences already. So, for example, work of the imprisoned should also be included in the sentence. Speaking of work, Castellano also answered to the question, why is work not being included more in the sentences? And the main reason she mentioned was because the jail has very different timing than normal society, meaning that, for example, in jail, people have lunch at 11:30, and they have dinner at 5 p.m., which is very, very different than Italian society. For the record, we usually have lunch between 1 and 2 p.m., or even later in the South, and have dinner between 8 and 9. So if an entrepreneur wants to give work to an imprisoned person, for example, it's going to be very difficult to do so with such timings. She stressed the fact that there's the need of alternative measures to detention. Detention cannot be the only sentence. There's also the problem of the lack of work. In Italy, we have problem of very high unemployment, so the work is lacking in general in the society for the imprisoned too. And when there is work, especially in the South, it's what we call black work, which means illegal. Speaking of the South, she also mentioned the big gap between North and South. There are much more imprisoned people in the North than in the South, she said. There's also the problem of the size of each jail. Some prisons are incredibly huge, and that's the biggest problem. Poggioreale is the one that she mentioned. There are about 2,000 imprisoned people there, and it's just unmanageable, completely unmanageable. She mentioned a cell with 14 imprisoned people living in the same cell with sharing only one bathroom, and they just were able to close that cell, to dismantle it. I'm going to close this summary just with some data that she gave, a comparison between Italian jails and American jails or prisons. In Italy, there are 100 imprisoned people over 100,000 inhabitants. In the United States, there are 600 imprisoned people over 100,000 inhabitants. The second talk that I attended was from the world wars to Ukraine. It was a Lectio Magistralis of Professor David Reynolds of the University of Cambridge. And I just listened to the very last bit of this talk, so it was the questions from the audience. The very last question I found very interesting. A lady from the audience asked how to answer to those people, those citizens who compare what Putin did to Ukraine with what the United States did to Iraq. The professor answered that the military action of the Americans were a reflection of a big shock. For the Americans, the experience of the world wars has been much more remote than any one of us, even of the British. Very, very few Americans during the wars, relatively, lost their lives due to the enemy. So in order to understand the Twin Towers attack, we have to understand that the Americans didn't have any idea of the horrors of the war up to that moment. And that's why that attack has been such a shock for their society. With the fall of the Soviet Union, they were convinced that they had won the Cold War, and they felt the call, the mission to export their values to the rest of the world at that point. It's from there, from that sense of victory, that originates their sense of hubris. Hubris is a Greek word that I'm going to put a text to explain what it is. I don't think it's a word in the American English vocabulary. Today, in a certain sense, the old Cold War is not finished because the big questions, big problems regard the United States and Russia. And he said, and I personally tend to support more the United States. That's what he said, of course. At this point of the video, you might have noticed a black on yellow writing, which is this one or this one. This is to remind that the festival Vicino Lontano keeps asking for truth for Giulio Regeni. Giulio Regeni was a young researcher at the University of Cambridge, originally from this region, Friuli Venezia Giulia. He went to El Cairo in Egypt to make a research for the university and was found killed in 2016. He had disappeared for a week, and his body was found with marks of extreme torture. We still don't know what exactly happened, and that's exactly why his parents, together with Amnesty International and the festival Vicino Lontano, are requesting truth for Giulio Regeni and justice. I invite you to check out his story on the links that you will find in the description down below. And I think this is a very important matter, not only for the individual young researcher, but also to defend the rights that we have, that we don't want big powers such as authoritarian governments to violate. That's why I think it is very important that we all request and demand truth for the case of Giulio Regeni. Now it's 7:30 p.m. and I would love to go listen to this talk called Foreigner Minors Not Accompanied. Sorry, I'm translating literally, it's horrible translation. Basically, there has been a law in Italy in 2017 that allows Italian citizens to sort of adopt certain minors that have immigrated to Italy without being accompanied, or they remained orphans, I guess. So this is such a super interesting thing, I don't know, but the problem is that at the same time, in the main location, which is this church here, there is this other talk, the lost power of young people. And of course, I have to go listen to what they have to say about this. The lost power of the young people. This is a huge topic in Italy, and this talk has revealed itself to be one of the most important of all the ones I have attended in this festival. The moderator was Stefano Allievi, a sociologist, who has well introduced this talk. He first mentioned that during the pandemic we have had more emigrants than immigrants. He followed by giving some other data. We have 3 active workers every 2 retired people, and it's getting worse. The demographic recession is slowly becoming an economic recession. Adults and elderlies have the monopoly of political power. Who goes to power decides what to do based on who votes for them. Another interesting phenomenon is that it's not anymore the young immigrants, young Italian immigrants that send money back home, as it's always been in the history of Italian immigration, but it's nowadays mostly the families who send money to the kids abroad so that they can stay there. Then there is the whole problem of the young people starting to work. The first few years they are required to do apprenticeships or contract for which they are not really paid. And these jobs are usually for very, very low positions. They end up doing photocopies or making coffee for the rest of the company. This represents for the society a great loss of productivity and creativity in the age where its citizens are most creative and productive. And it also means for these citizens that tomorrow they are going to have a much lower pension. Those who are 25 now are earning 25% less of what those who were 25 years old 20 years ago. And they famously don't leave home, don't leave their parents, their families, not because they love their families so much that they want to keep living with them, but because they are not able to. They don't really have the financial means, financial stability to do so. Allievi summed it up by calling this phenomenon a disinvestment on the future. The first guest has been Maria Letizia Tanturri, a demographer. She's given us a lot of data on which to resonate upon. In 1950, the young people of Italy, young citizens, were 8 million. Nowadays, there are 5.8 million. Because the population has been growing, in 1950, they were 1 over 5 citizens. Nowadays, the young people are 1 over 10 citizens. And now I'm probably going to shock some of my international viewers. The average age in Italy is 47 years old. The average age of who votes in Italy is 52. The second guest to talk has been Maurizio Merico, a sociologist. He has called the young people as the category of not yet. Young people are considered as ever yet learning, always still educating themselves, as if they were not yet able to do things. The power, for example, is denied to young people because it's not the time for them to have it yet. They are going to have it then. This might all sound strange to some of my international viewers, but believe me, this totally reflects the sentiments that I also have as a young Italian, because yes, I'm 33, but in Italy I'm considered still pretty young. The third guest has been Michela Vogrig. She was representing in this panel the world of social cooperative companies, so an entrepreneurial kind of point of view. She said, we claim that we want to give back the power to the young people, but in reality, they are never made part of the decision-making process. They are never asked to participate. And she said it's important to make them part of the decisional power of companies, not only because if we continue this way, we are going to be left without workers, but also because we are missing on an important creative potential. Politics for the young people should be built starting from politics on the workplace. The last guest to talk was really the only one that was part of these young generations of Italians. She's Wisal Hubabi, 28, poet, performer, artist, writer. Her contribution has been very much appreciated by the audience. She's daughter of immigrant parents from Morocco, so her experience as a young Italian is very much marked by this fact. She's talked about expectations, sense of guilt, destiny, rebellion. I feel like her conclusion has been the part that best described the condition of the young generations in Italy right now. She said, we won't have a house, we won't have a secure job, we won't have a pension, all things that the previous generation has and is expecting from us now. Therefore, we are also in the middle of a generational conflict with the previous generation. What we haven't been able to demonstrate to our parents so far, we are not even interested in demonstrating anymore. So now we just try to survive and especially try to understand the complex world we live in. This we do with a strong disenchantment towards the politics that should do something for us, should involve us, but instead cuts us out of any decision. Tonight for the 9 p.m. appointment, I repeated the experiment of following half of an event and half of the other event. So the first one has been history as a weapon. Historical type of talk. The journalist, writer and movie director Francesca Mannocchi has reflected a lot about the topic of education, which I find extremely important. And she asks what instruments have been given, what critical instruments have been given to the public opinion to contrast the political action. She stressed the fact that the soldiers that are fighting right now in Ukraine are young people educated based on a certain historical model, a certain historical narrative that sees the Western world as the enemy, the cruel people. Putin has been educating his citizens since 2012, and those kids that were in schools in 2012 are nowadays the soldiers that are fighting his war. She also drew parallelisms between the education, the role of education in the regimes like the Russian one, and in the fanaticisms like jihad, for example. They pay a lot of attention to education, to the curricula of the schools. And they tell us so. She has been reading certain documents, a document from Putin from 2012 where he was stating that he would do all these things, and we didn't listen. The second theme that she talked about was about the post-war. She stressed the fact that we tend to pay a lot of attention to wars, but we lose this attention after the wars are finished. So we lose that attention in the post-war phase, which is a crucial one because the post-war phases are the moments where are planted the seeds of tomorrow's conflicts. She says in Iraq, this has been very visible. History is written where someone realizes that they can leverage or exploit this potential of frustrated and impoverished citizens. And she finished saying that in the Middle East, there has been a lot of talks about Marshall plans, which had never arrived. And families with kids in these countries, they are going to send their kids to the most convenient school, which is the Quranic school, because they keep them also to eat, to sleep, and everything. And the same exact thing could happen in Ukraine after this war will be finished. The Ukrainian kids that are now seeing their fathers going to war are going to be traumatized by this event. So many schools in the country have been destroyed at this point, and it is very, very important for us to realize that if these kids are going to be left alone with their traumas, they are going to fall into nationalist movements tomorrow. The last conference for today has been Beyond State, an experiment, a feminine experiment in Kurdistan, featuring Havin Gunezer, which is an engineer and women's rights activist from Turkey, I believe. The question is how to go beyond to overcome the violent power of the state. She described the Kurdish movement of liberation. From the Sumerians, the power of the state has slowly become capitalist, and it has been taking the monopoly of everything, of school, education, violence, culture, and so on. The more the dominion of the state included everything, the more the citizens have been deprived of their space. So how do we let citizens become free again? She says, we are all reduced improvised video shooting outside in the city. This is what you get. She says, we are all reduced as numbers, as just being consumers in this capitalist society. And we all accept this because we keep working in school, in offices, in factories, and we Kurdish want to change this system, change this world. We don't accept the system the way it is. In order to change this world, we want to disrupt the system because we are against this system. We don't like it. We want to find a new form of autonomous democracy. we don't want to create a new state because we are aware that it would end up being most likely as corrupted as the state nowadays is, but we would just like to have a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more freedom and independence. Sorry, she didn't use the word independence. Jin, Jian, Azadi. This is the Kurdish slogan. It means woman, life, freedom. Gunezer explained how Jin, Jian, they have the same root, so woman and life. And therefore, this is not just a formal slogan, it's very substantial for the Kurdish movement. Women and women's rights are a fundamental part of the movement. Jin, Jian, Azadi. Good night.